said because you're normal. You're ungrateful. We fight, risk our lives for you. Evil mutants, robots, crazy aliens. I gave him up. I gave him up because you can't say thank you. Because I have to stomach your questions and prove that I'm a person. I lie because the truth is we're nothing like you. Thank God, because it's the only reason you people are still alive.
Think about the strongest character you know. The one a team looks to in a crisis, the one who always shows up, the one who always holds everything together when everyone else falls apart. Now ask yourself, who would that be? For the X-Men, that would be Cyclops, the first X-Men. And to understand Cyclops, you have to understand Scott Summers. So what makes Cyclops or Scott Summers so fascinating psychologically? It's that his identity as a leader isn't something that he chose, it's something that was constructed for him before he was old enough to resist it as Charles Xavier's prized pupil. Cyclops' origin is one of the most quietly devastating origins in comics. As a child, he watches his parents' plane go down while he's on it, and he's forced to jump from the aircraft with his younger brother Alex, sharing a single parachute. They survive, yes, but the events left a traumatic scarification both emotionally and physically as the debris from the aircraft hits his head and he subsequently loses control of his mutation when his X gene will eventually activate later. He ends up in an orphanage, one that, as we later learn in Uncanny X-Men 144 in the Infernal storyline, was secretly run by Mr. Sinister, who has been monitoring and manipulating Cyclops since childhood. His entire development, environmental upbringing was engineered and constructed by external forces beyond his control. Then when Professor Xavier or Charles Xavier finds him, he immediately recruits him into his child soldier crusade with the mission of protecting humanity from mutant kind. See, at this time, he's only 16 years old, and nobody, not Xavier, not his teammates, not the narrative itself, for a very long time at least, really asked the question, what does Scott want? Who is Scott, separate from Cyclops and from the function as a leader? This is a question that will haunt Cyclops as time goes on. It's that duality of X responsibility and personal desires outside of the X-Men that Cyclops can never achieve. One can say the most humanly complicated chapter of Scott's story, and the one that fandom has never fully forgiven him for, was that after Jean's death, Scott attempted to live beyond the X-Men. He tried to live a normal life. He married a woman named Madelyne Pryor and had a son, Nathan Christopher Summers, who would eventually become Cable, and was building something outside of the X uniform. There was an unspoken contract, though, that was handed to him, that's ultimately handed to men, that usually before they're old enough to even read it, and that unspoken contract was something that parallels the struggle of Cyclops. It goes something like this: you protect, you provide, you persist, and you do it all without complaint. And it isn't far to say that Cyclops isn't able to self-reflect the situation and understand the burdens of leadership and responsibility, but it tends to only follow a particular cycle or a predictable cycle of if and when Jean dies. It starts with prioritization, putting others first, which is rooted in genuine love and responsibility. That is the ideal healthy version we want to see in Cyclops, but for some reason it then tips to deprioritization, where his own needs don't just come second, they stop registering at all. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing on the surface, because ultimately responsibility is noble. Caring for others is one of the most meaningful things a human being can do, but somewhere along the way, that contract previously mentioned got amended quietly without anyone signing off on it, and a new clause just got added. And that clause would be, and you do this at the expense of yourself. An expense he carried since he was a child. So when he leaves Madelyne Pryor and baby Cable to start a new X team with Jean, we see a shift in character from hero to morally complex, expanding his role from the stand-up guy or the morally upright man. Chris Claremont, the writer of the X-Men at the time, hated this notion, thinking that this tarnished his persona as a hero and he wasn't wrong, but it did grant Cyclops dimensions and layers that readers could pick up on. This is a perfect illustration of how identity destroys a man's capacity for ordinary human relationships. Scott's normal life was never fully real to him because he never left his identity as Cyclops. The mission, the dream, and ultimately Jean as the Phoenix, as his first love, as the person connected to that identity, was to Scott not just a woman, but she was his purpose made human. He didn't leave Madelyne for Jean the person, although that could be argued. He did leave Madelyne because she represented something he didn't believe he was allowed to have: a quiet life, happiness for himself. And when the mission called, a man who had spent his entire life being a leader didn't know how to stay put. This is what the self-neglect cycle does in the most extreme form, and it doesn't just cost the man, it costs everyone around him. And it was Grant Morrison's run that we saw the reality of the burden that would contribute to the greater conversation. It shows us what happens to the man when the weight has been carried for so long that he no longer remembers what he wanted. In this point in X-Men's history, Scott is in a passionless marriage. He begins an emotional psychic affair with Emma Frost. Jean, who has been on her own with her Phoenix complications at this point, can telepathically feel that something is happening and doesn't stop it. There's a bleakness to this whole arc that ramped up the soap opera aspect of the X-Men that some fans like and others don't. In this run, Scott isn't supposed to be perceived as bad, but rather hollow. The weight of his wife's ever-growing power and his previous encounter with Apocalypse has compressed him into something efficient and joyless. He leads, he functions, he makes right tactical calls, and he is, in every way that matters, personally gone. However, it's House of M where I think the character truly changed, or at least the events after it, because at this time the biggest threat did not come from Magneto or the Sentinel program or Boulevard Trask. It came from one of their own, Wanda, who at this point in history was a mutant, eradicated majority of their species. Cyclops felt responsibility for this tragic moment. He felt responsible for mutant kind. This burden of the X-Men accelerates through House of M and into the Messiah Complex storyline, where Scott begins making decisions that cross the line even his closest allies find it troubling. He creates X-Force, a Black Ops assassination squad, and keeps it secret from the broader team, including from the people he loves. And what you see is that in the mid-2000s and 2010s, Marvel gives us a man who has completely fused his identity with his leadership role, that he no longer distinguishes between what he wants and what he believes mutant kind needs. Those two things have become one. He's not leading anymore, he's ultimately the mission. And that is one of the most dangerous places a person can be, because when you are the mission, anything becomes justifiable in service of it. In X-Men Schism, everything Scott has been suppressing breaks into the open, not as a breakdown, but as a collision with one of his closest allies. This specific flashpoint is a child, a young mutant named Idy, who is faced with a situation where she has to kill to protect the X-Men. Logan says, "Don't put that on her, send adults." Scott says she can handle it, she's a soldier. And Wolverine, who is himself a deeply compromised figure, looks at Scott Summers and sees something that horrifies him, a man who's been leading for so long that he stopped seeing the cost, and who has so thoroughly suppressed his own need for safety and arrest that he can no longer protect others from being conscripted into the same cycle. And I think this is something that Marvel wanted to comment on. Like, yes, Scott isn't wrong. Through the years of the X-Men, they have faced so much adversity that one can only see the negativities of humanity. And Scott is saying that the war is real, and it is very real, and you see it as a reader. But Wolverine isn't wrong either. Being a man who has been a weapon and been in multiple wars, Wolverine is responding to not the tactical decision, he's responding to what Scott has become. A man who no longer flinches, no longer hesitates, who has sacrificed so much of his own humanity in the service of the mission that he's lost the ability to protect humanity with the new generation of mutants. For so many years, Cyclops has embodied the Boy Scout or the stern by the book form of masculinity, often serving as a foil to more rebellious or physically aggressive characters like Wolverine. And yes, while his character has evolved over 60 years in the comics, his role generally adheres to or directly deconstructs traditional male leadership norms. What we see is what burnout looks like from a leader during the Schism storyline. Scott is tired. That's what happens when a man spends decades giving everything and receiving nothing in return. He stopped being able to recognize when enough means enough for everyone. The school ultimately splits and the X-Men fracture, and Scott builds a new nation of mutants. Avengers vs. X-Men is where the arc reaches its logical conclusion, and what I want to do is frame it through the lenses of our broader conversation, because if you read Avengers vs. X-Men as purely a superhero conflict, you miss what actually is happening to Scott Summers' character. The Phoenix Force returns. Scott believes is coming for Hope Summers in the Mutant Messiah, and that it will ignite the mutant species after Scarlet Witch's hex. The Avengers want to destroy it, and logically so, seeing the events of what happened to Jean under the Phoenix's influence, and Scott is willing to go to war with Earth's mightiest heroes to protect what he believes is mutant salvation. This is presented in the provider identity at its absolute extreme. Cyclops has spent his entire life protecting mankind, and it's costing him everything. And now he believes he is close to making all the sacrifices mean something, to winning, to delivering the promise he made Xavier, to Jean, to every mutant who has died under his watch. He's not going to stop. He can't stop, because stopping means facing the question he never allowed himself to answer. Was all of this necessary? What was this for? And unfortunately, this is the run where Cyclops kills Professor Xavier under the influence of the Phoenix. His surrogate father, the man who gave him purpose, the man for who, better or for worse, made him Cyclops. Was he possessed by the Phoenix? Yes, but Cyclops, the man who never breaks, finally broke. And the thing that breaks him is not the enemy. It was the full weight of everything that has been carrying finally finding its way out of him. In the aftermath, he loses. He is imprisoned, and for the first time in his publication history, Cyclops is seen as a villain and not as the leader of the X-Men. But like all good things, that doesn't stop him. He becomes a revolutionary and a mutant martyr. He is broken out of prison, starts a new school, and resumes his mission. He keeps moving practically, and because the man has never learned how to stop, even stripped away from everything, the identity reasserts itself. That burden doesn't lift, it just becomes a circumstance of change. And here's a question I keep coming back to with Cyclops. Who are you, and what is your mission without the actual mission? Who is Scott Summers? Now, there are glimpses throughout the decades, a dry sense of humor that almost never gets to the surface, a genuine deep connection or capacity for love for Jean, his son, and for his team that gets buried under tactical calculations. A man who, in quiet moments, is warmer than the uniform suggests. But those moments are rare, and they are rare because of the narrative. The character himself treats them as indulgences, as things he doesn't have time for, things a leader can't afford. In a framework of our last video, we looked at Storm outgrowing the X-Men, but this one, Scott Summers, is ultimately the example of self-neglect that burden places upon him being the leader of the X-Men. He is the provider who gave everything, the caretaker who had no one to call. The rock carried the weight until the weight carried him. And that's what makes it tragic rather than sad that Cyclops chose this. Not freely, not with full information, but with genuine conviction. He believed in Charles' dream, as do most of the X-Men, but the truth wore itself down. The truth wore him down. The Ruby Quartz visor keeps the world safe from Cyclops' power, but nothing in the 60 years of publication for the character keeps Scott safe from the world. And that's a story Marvel has been telling with Cyclops, sometimes intentionally, sometimes by accident, over these 60 years. And I think it's finally worth naming. What does it actually cost a man to be the one everyone relies on? The provider role identity, the self-neglect cycle, and why the men who give the most are often least likely to ask for anything in return. And this isn't about victimhood in Cyclops' stance, it's about understanding a pattern that affects this character throughout the cycle of his publication history. But thank you for watching. If you don't mind, please do all the YouTube things, like, share, subscribe. Let me know in the comments what you think of Cyclops' role as the leader of the X-Men. I'm Anderson, and I'm out. Bye.